When I say the 20th century, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? There are a bunch of options. It's the two world wars primarily, the Great Depression, the first man on the moon, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, the tremendous technological advancement that we've experienced, the invention of the personal computer, all that. But involuntarily, subconsciously, the first thing that actually comes to our minds, especially to the minds of people of the older generation, is fascism, as that was the ideology that emerged in the 20th century and was responsible for the greatest conflict in human history that left millions of people dead, millions of people wounded, stranded, half of Europe in ruins. So, how did it even come to power? Basically, what was happening in Europe at the time was that the governments just consisted of two major parties. There was the Social Democratic Party and the major Liberal or Conservative Party. And they constantly just butt-headed each other over votes. They didn't provide any real solutions to the problems that arose at those times. So basically, the governments just sucked. They were extremely unstable, coalitions changed. Sometimes the government just stayed in power for a couple of months, even a couple of weeks. And then it got voted out because it just couldn't handle the problems. Like the way the Great Depression was handled, it was a complete and utter disaster. For years, millions of people were unemployed, inflation was in the hundreds, and the only thing that actually fixed it, no matter how cynical this sounds, was the Second World War. But that's not the point. The point is that the governments of those times had no idea how to handle the issues at hand. And then people started looking for alternatives, someone else who could bring a new breath to politics. And a couple of guys understood that, and they just went like, yeah, we got that. And they came out with this ideology that was rooted in hatred towards everyone else, towards other nations, nationalities, religions, sexual minorities, gypsies, Jews, Slavs, everyone. And they just didn't want to take responsibility for screwing up their economies. They blamed everyone. This blaming sold really well because people obviously didn't want to take responsibility. No one wants to do that. They claimed that if they were at power, they would expand their nations to empire-sized states, conquer neighbor states, strip them of their resources, kill thousands, millions of people for living space for their own people. And what's really scary is that all of this, it sounded completely okay for people at those times. So many people supported it. They didn't think that there was anything wrong with it. And what happened was a fractured Europe and the Second World War that pretty much destroyed the European economy. Now, if someone was preaching this kind of ideology right now, it would be insane, because things are different right now. People are generally more educated, kind of more open-minded. They generally try to think before they do something. However, even now with all that, the EU elections of 2014 are really, really scary, and I'll tell you why. And yeah, this speech will be focused on Europe. So basically what happened right now is we have the same thing as in the beginning of the 20th century. We've got a major liberal party, a major social democratic party. They fight over votes. They claim to present new ideas, new solutions. Well, at the same time, they're essentially the same. One gets voted in, or the other gets voted in. It's the same foreign policy, same internal policy, economic policy. Everything is the same with just minor adjustments. And it's basically not like you're voting for different parties. It's like you're voting for the same thing, but just different factions that differ on some minor issues, but on a larger scale is the same. And people get really angry with this. They vote for someone, he gets into office, he screws up, people get angry at him, they vote him out, vote another guy in, he sucks again, they vote him out, another guy, and it goes on and on and on. And again, some people realize that if they say the right things at the right time, they might get votes, and they might get some really cool stuff going on for them if people start to like them. So they caught this anti-establishment vibe, and they preach that the EU is generally a bad idea, that they want their country out of there, that they want to lower the taxes. They claim that higher taxes hurt small business holders, while the big company executives are just fine. They want to limit immigration because, as they claim, immigrants are stealing jobs from the local populace. And people kind of like this. They buy it. They vote for these people. So, as an example, we've got, for example, the UKIP, the UK Independence Party in Britain. It's led by Nigel Farage. It's actually kind of moderate compared to other parties like that, other French parties. Then we have the Front National, the National Front in France, headed by Marine Le Pen, who isn't as dictatorial as her dad was, but is still not good enough. And then we have Jobbik in Hungary, which is completely screwed up. It was accused of being outright fascist, anti-Semitist, racist. They made remarks like that. It can be proved, and they're still a pretty big driving force. So, what unites all these parties is mainly their anti-EU sentiment. They don't like the regulations imposed on them by the European Union. They don't like the taxes imposed on them by the European Union. They don't like that the EU generally prefers its member states to follow a set foreign policy line. This last one really resonates with Le Pen's National Front, as, for example, back in the 90s, her dad was besties with Saddam Hussein. And now, she suddenly, lately, said that Putin is actually a pretty cool guy, and she supports the Crimean occupation by Russia. So, the UKIP, probably the more moderate one, still the same anti-EU, anti-establishment rhetoric. Their leader really likes to pose with a mug of beer, smoking a cigarette for newspapers. And actually, their solution for Britain to go out of the EU, short term, it might actually not be that bad for Britain, as they won't have to contribute as much to the EU. They're one of the biggest contributors to the EU budget. They won't be dragged into conflicts if something happens. However, losing such a member state will mean a tremendous loss to the EU. And if a conflict arises and the EU falls, Britain will lose a potential ally, and a very important ally. So it will be isolated just like it was in World War II. And the UKIP even was founded as a one-issue party. It just wanted out of the EU. So all their policies are not that well thought through. Now, Jobbik is a completely different thing. Their deputy parliamentary leader claimed that Jews living in Hungary are a national security risk. One of their deputy chairmen referred to the Holocaust as a holo scam. They even tried to push legislation through that would illegalize gay propaganda and would install jail terms for it, which basically means that holding hands in public would mean you would get locked up. The party even has its own militia, a bunch of guys in military uniforms marching around, singing songs, and it's actually pretty scary. It's just like the Nazi party in the Third Reich. And over 1 million Hungarians voted for the party. It is currently the second largest party in the country, which means it is one of the driving political forces. It can push through legislation. And that is really extremely scary that people like that got votes. So basically what seems to be happening is the same as was in the beginning of the 20th century. We had these two parties, then the third party came out with brand new ideas. People started liking it, but actually things are a bit different right now. They aren't as straightforward. So we've got two ways this whole situation can go. One way is that the major parties will realize what is actually happening and will use all the influence they have to leave these fringe parties as the third choice that would get a couple of % of votes. They would never be any driving political force. They wouldn't be able to push legislation. They would just be there, and that's it. They won't be able to do anything. That's a good thing. The second scenario is much, much worse, though. What can happen is that these parties will get real power. They will get their countries out of the EU, and eventually the EU will collapse. It will just be a bunch of different countries with a bunch of different goals, fighting over territorial disputes that go back to the 15th century, and that's it. And if a conflict arises, they will just be taken out one by one. And it's not even the military concern, it's also the economical concern. For example, Russia imports a bunch of energy resources to the EU. If EU is fractured and it is no longer a union of countries, This means that Russia will be able to set an individual price for each country, which means that if some countries it likes, the price will be lower. If a country it doesn't like, the price will be higher. And no one will be able to protect these countries because there will be no international body to enforce regulations or agreements and stuff like that. So, in fact, even though these parties are claiming to be liberating their countries, they're instead just replacing the problems they're having right now with even bigger problems. Now, how did we even come to this? Basically, people became lazy. People became comfortable with what they have. They started taking everything for granted. Do you know what was the percentage of votes that the National Front got in France? It was 20%, 1/5 of votes. You know how many people actually voted? 40%. So it means that only 8% of the population supports the Nationalist Party, but it still got 1/5 of the votes because the 60% were too comfortable with their position and they were just like, well, whatever, nothing is going to change, so if I go and vote, it's not going to do much, so I'm just going to stay here and not do it. And that's how the party, the National Front, got 20% of votes, got real political power, because people were just lazy and not active. And from here arises the solution to this problem that actually you can fix it, and here's how. Basically, just be active. Join your local party, whatever it is, whatever you like, campaign for it, tell your friends to vote for it, tell your family to vote for it yourself, vote at the presidential elections, the parliamentary elections, the EU parliamentary elections, everywhere. Just be active. Don't be lazy. Don't be comfortable with the situation you're in. And you will keep these fringe parties from gaining power and from screwing your country up. Right now, it might not seem like that much of a problem to you because you don't really feel the impacts of it. But once it starts rolling, there will be no way to stop it. And really, it's better to be able to travel wherever you want, to be protected, to feel safe at some expense, than lose all that safety just because of your nationalistic pride. That's it.